is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. United Nations, the WHO, the OECD, and on, council of this and council of that, a jungle and conglomerate of institutions. But serving whom exactly and how effectively? Good evening and welcome on Smart Sustainability, where we look at sustainable mechanisms from a holistic perspective and systems in line with natural laws, meaning natural principles. There's little most people know about the United Nations or the WHO, except that it supposedly helps prevent war and serves as a stabilizer for peace. We don't know how it works, how it operates, who runs these organizations, and what they actually entail. Things we should know, as it turns out. There's so much push for sustainability everywhere. But see, sustainable are systems only then to the extent where they incorporate natural laws, the laws of the universe. Many of our systems today, like the United Nations or the WHO, push for a primary role in determining human life on the planet. Now, is that sustainable, based on natural principles, and actually really good for us? Our topic today, the insights and outs of the United Nations, the WHO, and how those systems are intertwined and thus affect us. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Now, I grew up at the Iron Curtain, actually right at the border between East and West. As a second-generation post-World War II child, so to speak, the United Nations, NATO, the WHO were kind of guarantees for safety for many of us for a long time. Well, at least that's what we believed. But all systems are subject to the law of transience, meaning that anything that is established in the physical world has a beginning and an end. Systems tip. It's as simple as that. We've seen empires rise and fall for that very reason. A system can endure longer depending on how closely it actually incorporates natural laws and natural principles. And yes, those do exist. They are the very foundation of what the world was created with and is based on. We all, for example, every living being carry the blueprint of the fundamental laws of nature inherently in us. They are the principles of life and the principles of death in the physical world. Many of our systems in place are currently undergoing a crisis because their validity and foundation is not fully in line with those natural principles. So as a consequence, many of the established institutions face huge challenges. Some natural, because all systems have a tipping point, similar to a water pond when you think about, when there's not enough movement and air to keep the water body flowing, so to speak, then the pond at some point literally tips into a murky, deadly body. The same happens with soil. When soil experiences too long suboptimal conditions, so to speak, its self-stability gets eroded, and the structure of the foundation is destroyed. And the same happens in institutions and individuals, for that matter. The United Nations has much deeper roots than most people think. Most of us have this dream that we need an overarching body to collaborate on world peace. To what extent the United Nations can live up to this today is what we want to explore this evening. And my guests are Dr. Astrid Stuckelberger, a well-known, outspoken professor and researcher at the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Geneva and Lausanne in Switzerland, as well as at many others. She's an advocate for human rights, gender, health, and a science-based approach to debates. She's also an expert on the United Nations and the WHO. And we have Shabnam Parleza Mohamed. She's founder of Transformative Health Justice, Executive Director of Children's Health Defense in Africa, and member of the Steering Committee of the World Council for Health. A lawyer by trade and a journalist who's deeply engaged in tracking and tracing United Nations and WHO movements. Thanks so much, ladies, for joining us tonight. One health, one world, one constitution for 7 billion people? Seriously? Sounds a lot like one God, or better said, a copycat structure, so to speak, of the divine, a forgery, charlatanism, if you want to call it, to the real divine. Is the United Nations or the WHO a vehicle for a one world constitution?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, after living those 4+ years, and analyzing what's going on, they are calling for one world government through the One Health agenda, through the we are all together, quality, etc. But what I, in my whole career with WHO and the United Nations, can see today is that this United Nations, which had very noble, really noble principles, I thought that, yes, it's great to be all together, has turned into, like you said, a very murky pot, I would say, because they have been turning into a dictatorship, definitely. Not obeying to member states, not even listening to the voices of the people, and just trying to change the legal texts of the United Nations and of WHO to use them illegally to turn this in a global coup d'etat. So what I can also say is that I'm doing now more and more conferences on the premeditated construction of the United Nations as a one world government. Because when you analyze the history, I just will say that briefly, and then we can keep on, is that when you look at the history, it all started in Geneva with the League of Nations after the World War I, which was a very deadly war. And because of that, member states said we cannot let that happen again. So they created the League of Nations in Geneva with many treaties in 1918. And then happened the Second World War, and everybody pulled out of the League of Nations. And what happened is that they created the United Nations after that in Geneva, but with the headquarters in New York, saying that because it failed in Geneva, blah, blah. But actually, Geneva is the seat of most United Nations key agencies. And I'm a witness of that because there are more than 30 programs, special agencies of the United Nations in Geneva that have massive power in the world, of which WHO, the International Labour Organization, the World Organization of Trade Organization, the refugees, the migration, the development, the ITU, the telecommunication and AI for good, and the WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization. And I mean, I can mention, meteorological, more and more and more, to the point that I was called to organize the UN Open Day twice for the government, because I had worked so much with the UN and I knew all the agencies. And I thought this is really the headquarters. And that's why today Geneva is becoming the headquarters of this coup d'etat. I can say it because it is in the making. We're going to talk about this now, about what happened at during those 4 past years.
So what I'm hearing you say, though, is basically that we continue to have that same origin as it started in Geneva, with very little changes other than renaming it and putting the headquarters seats for the public, so to speak, to New York. Is that what I was hearing?
Yes, I can add something very important that I forgot to say, is that the headquarters in New York has the power. Why? Because they created this Security Council with 5 main states who have a veto power. So this Security Council decides about peace, war, justice, and who is leading the United Nations, the Secretary General and the General Assembly, having all the prime ministers and presidents. And this Security Council, 5 member states are, and this is not a hazard, it's not by chance, it's United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And that means, for me today, that they direct the world. 5 states are directing this world under the name of, they have bigger population than anybody else. But this does not make a democracy.
No, it doesn't.
And there is already something wrong there. And in the NGO world, where I was also, fighting for rights of women and older persons and peace, we were already saying in this group that this Security Council is totally illegal.
But actually, if most people, I mean, just to play devil's advocate here, if you actually look back to the Security Council in general, I think if you look back and ask most people how effective the Security Council has been, so to speak, and how anyone would actually expect something really good come out of the United Nations particularly, most people would say it really hasn't been very effective in anything so far. So why would we now assume that they suddenly take on a power that was completely ineffective up to this point?
Yeah, what's interesting is that the Security Council, those past years has not been very voiceful. They have not really spoken much, except for Gaza, Palestine, a little bit. With Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov from Russia, has been really the only one of all the member states, of those 5 states, who really denunciated that there was a lack of democracy in the United Nations. And I really spotted that out like a very interesting crisis within the United Nations. Yeah. This is not normal. The other thing that nobody knows is that the Security Council hosts the International Criminal Court, the International Justice Court, and the Nuremberg Code, as well as the Convention on Bioweapons, which is what we're looking for with the biotech vaccine experiment. So they have in their hands the magic of making war and peace in the world, and to decide which tribunal for Rwanda or for Kosovo should be taking place, but not for today's crime against humanity. So you see how perverse this is? And it means that the other states that are turning within the 15 members for 4 years are turning around, but not those 5 states. They are really the seat of what's happening today. And we can really question what is going on from the bottom up to the top. And I want to say that the United Nations is based on 2 texts: the United Nations Charter of the United Nations, to be correct spelling, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When you look at that, the Charter of the United Nations hosts the International Criminal Court regulation in it. Mm-hmm. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is really what is the people's rights. It should be what the people's rights is. And in the Charter, you find in the preamble that we, the people, are supposed to have all the rights, the right to live, the right to everything, and it should be respected in the whole United Nations. And that's the overarching framework that looked so great to me, 10 years ago. And then I saw that it wasn't working that way.
Yeah. Exactly. So as I said at the beginning, at some point it tips. I want to get to Shabnam here for a moment. So most of us, Shabnam, have a natural desire for peace, right? I think it's a very humanly ingrained desire and wish. And the more things are going on in the world, I think the more people have a tendency to wish that there was just one body that would make it all go away and give us this eternal, nice, harmonious planet, so to speak. But so most of our generation kind of grew up with these institutions and thinking that they would do that. But from what you've looked into, Shabnam, for example, with the WHO, for example, is there such a thing as bundling it all up into one big, good, nice voice?
Absolutely not. And I'll speak as someone who 20 years ago had this ambition and vision of becoming the Secretary General of the United Nations. And about 10 years later, interviewed an International Criminal Court judge who said to me, "I'm so glad you didn't go in that direction." The UN, as Astrid has alluded to, is essentially a monopoly. It is the pretext and pretense of democracy happening in one space. But if you speak to member states outside of that Security Council who repeatedly try to pass resolutions and get vetoed via an unlawful, undemocratic so-called Security Council, you'd understand that most of those countries are deeply unhappy with working within this framework but don't seem to realize that they're not trapped by it. They can actually withdraw and form regional alliances and international cooperation with each other that would be far more effective at building peace and security and prosperity outside the corporate monopoly that in fact infects the United Nations as much as the WHO. In fact, they have funders in common, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, MasterCard, and others. No surprise then that the UN works the way it does or doesn't. It is dysfunctional. And the secret is that it's not a mistake. It's engineered that way. It's designed to be broken. But we have to remember the words of people like Albert Einstein, who said, one definition of insanity is doing the same thing expecting a different result, right?
Yeah.
And so all these member states that keep going back thinking the UN is going to magically provide all the solutions that they need is unrealistic, or they've been captured. We know that the representatives who attend both the WHO and the UN are unelected and unaccountable. It's not to say that all of them are unethical or they can't think critically, etc. But the pressure to actually conform with the status quo under threat of sanctions, trade restrictions, and media disinformation about your country is so great that in fact at the World Health Assembly number 77, I spoke to a delegate who was inside and who privately told me that member states were threatened to go along with the IHR amendment. Now we know that the treaty has been paused, and that's not a victory. So, they say the eternal price of democracy is vigilance. We've got to be vigilant about it. But the IHR 2005 amendments, some of those resolutions, some of them were watered down, yes, were passed under threat. And so therefore they are unlawful, using unilateral coercive measures such as sanctions, etc.
What kind of threats happened there? Just to follow up on that. And who was threatened by whom?
Right. So I was told by a delegate that the Tedros himself had threatened member states with sanctions, trade restrictions, and being maligned in the media, even though just a day before, many member states had objected to various provisions, to threats on sovereignty, including, for example, Slovakia. And so when it came to that last day, late at night, when everyone was so tired on Saturday, the 1st of June, there was not even a vote. There was not in a quorum. How many countries are still present? Can we have a show of hands? There was no show of hands. It was just, as our resolution, look up for 3 seconds. No one's saying anything. Okay, we passed it. And the UN has done a similarly unlawful astroturfing of democracy. In fact, in September, at the General Assembly held by the UN, where they unlawfully passed a political declaration on pandemics, merging the role essentially of the UN and the WHO. Again, there were 11 countries who in writing articulately objected to the lack of transparency, inclusivity, unilateral coercive measures, etc. And despite them breaking the silence, the president of the UNGA 78 just pretended as if this political declaration had passed. So we're actually dealing with a cartel here. This is not democracy. It's plutocracy, it's oligarchy, it's technocracy, and it certainly does not serve the interests of the people. But it's becoming far worse. As I've tried to maintain over the last 4 years, in fact, what got my attention first was that new pandemic treaty. And I saw red flags all over the place. This was last quarter of 2021. And then I met with Astrid, and she brought the IHR amendments to my attention. And we've been working together since then, thank God, as this building movement around the world around health and human rights. But now I've tried along the way, but people were so consumed with the WHO, which is a tiny part of the UN superstructure, as Astrid will tell you. In the Hydra, the WHO is one arm. The body is the UN, and then
I want to get to that. I want to get to that in a second, because I want to break this down and unpack this really for viewers to clearly understand how this is all part of the overall octopus, if you want to call it like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you want to come back to that?
Yeah, I'll come back. Finish your sentence first, what you were saying about if you have something to add to the threats and how states are being threatened, and then we'll unpack the structure.
Right. So the UN is a far bigger threat to us than the WHO, because they can actually facilitate weapons of mass destruction such as sanctions which I cover in an article I wrote for Children's Health Defense Africa called "Can the WHO and the UN impose sanctions for non-compliance?" And my research says yes. Back in 2021, the German health minister, Mike Ryan, who works for the WHO, and Tedros were all talking the language of sanctions. And this is predictive programming to get countries to understand that if you do not comply with what we want you to do, we will in fact impose sanctions. And the only way they can do this is through the United Nations. And it's not inconceivable that they would even deploy troops into our countries to make sure that there is compliance. So the UN now is seeking far expanded powers over what it supposedly has. It wants powers, and I'll pause on this point, over 10 areas of life essentially through an emergency platform. And they want control over the following expanded emergency powers: 1, pandemics; 2, wars and nuclear events; 3, climate or environmental events, degradation or disaster; 4, accidental or deliberate release of biological agents; 5, disruptions in the flow of goods, people, or finance; 6, disruptions in cyberspace or global digital connectivity; 7, a cyber attack on critical infrastructure; 8, a major event in outer space; 9, unforeseen risks or black swan events; and finally, technological or scientific developments gone wrong, in other words, AI. And if you look at those 10, at least 6 or 7 are already happening. So they are building up the case for the UN to have standing authority over what they define as complex global emergencies, and the enormous bureaucracy and money laundering and resource leaching that is going to take place unless we resist.
Well, let me ask you, both of you here, and actually one thing I want to add, because it's interesting. I too, at some point at the very beginning of my career, I really wanted to work for the United Nations because I loved the idea of all those different countries coming together and so, you know, and really collaborating, etc. Until I went there. And I got a really bad feeling just going into the building. It was stifling. It was so bureaucratic, you could barely breathe. People who are sensitive to energy flows and stuff like that, it was just like, so I came out totally disillusioned afterwards. I was like, oh my God, I was completely wrong on this entire United Nations construct in what it is, what it says, because there's such a discrepancy of what it says is in the ideal version and what it actually is. But let me ask both of you that question. So if you look at bureaucracy, I've never seen a functioning bureaucracy. In fact, all bureaucracies at some point are completely ineffective and they're disastrous. So where do you think even this thinking that we have one giant institution that then regulates the rest of the world, so to speak, actually is coming from, and making them even believe for 1 second that this is in any way doable or effective? When you look at how completely absurd and ineffective all major basically blown up bureaucracies are. I mean, these inflated bureaucracies that we have. The left doesn't know what the right does, the top doesn't know what the bottom does, no one knows anything, and it's completely disconnected and a complete waste of resources. So where do you think this idea comes from, and even the belief that this is a doable thing? Either one of you, who wants to go first?
I can jump in just for the first part. Well, for me, it's very simple. And analyzing it is that they have mimicked governments and shaped governments. It was go here, go there, and try to make a world government the whole way. So what they did is, you have to understand, and I know that not many people understand. You have in the United Nations, the whole United Nations bubbles, and you can pull out a chart called the United Nations system on image on Google, and you will see really all the bubbles and different organizations. All those obey to the same regulations, same way of voting, same things of members. So it's actually easy to mimic and to reproduce. Now, what is interesting that people don't know is that the United Nations different specialized agencies that correspond to government parts meet every year at a certain moment with the prime minister, the minister of that department. So they are in constant link with all the permanent missions and with all the ministers. I'll take you examples. The United Nations General Assembly meets every year in September for 2 weeks in New York. Prime Minister, presidents of every 194 states. So that's for the president. So they meet, and then they meet in between, because every country in New York and in Geneva have permanent missions to the United Nations. So they're in relation since many years with all the states already, like a world government. It was already building up. So now you get WHO, all the health ministries of health meet every year in Geneva, because WHO is in Geneva, the 2 last weeks of May, in principle, always. And this year they met exceptionally a bit later, only 1 week. But so all the health ministers with their cabinet meet in Geneva with all the states and decide for the agenda of the health in the world as a standardization process, little by little, step by step. It was, every country has sovereignty, and I was teaching health systems and international health regulation with WHO. Every country has their own health system to be respected with culture. So we cannot standardize. That was a goal. We were really teaching that and respecting that in 2009 to 2014. And so then I can break it down to the Minister of Education meets in UNESCO Paris. I don't know which month, but every year. The ILO, the International Labour Office in Geneva, one of the biggest institutions, tripartite, employer, employee, and syndicat, there's unions. They meet in Geneva every June, 2 weeks, at the same place as the WHO. And then you get that with the telecommunication, Minister of Telecommunication meet in Geneva, the Minister of Meteorological, or the expert of meteorological meets in Geneva, the expert of the intellectual property, the Minister of Refugee and Migration, they're both in Geneva. So Geneva is actually not as bureaucratic as New York. You would come to Geneva, you would be very interested, because there is a very important agency. It's the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, which is supposedly, managing all the conflicts between states, within NGOs, with civil society. And they have 4 sessions every year, 3 or 4, at least 3. It's the UPR, it's a Universal Periodic Review that modified, reformed the system many times. So every country goes through a review, analysis, criticism by special rapporteur or by country experts, and they have the blame game in the United Nations in Geneva, and I've been there many times and listened to them and say, oh my God, is this going to bring something? Like Palestine and Gaza has always been an issue. Now with Yemen, it's even worse. The Middle East was always on fire since I've been there, for the last 30 years almost. So you have to understand, it is bubbles of a whole system. They meet regularly. They have budgets, and there is no transparency. We don't know how the budget goes. And then you have different programs like humanitarian programs. And this is ad hoc. So beyond the bubbles, there is a whole system of flowing the money towards a project earmarked, like OCHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, who makes so much money with donation. Bill Gates and the Clinton Foundation and Carter Foundation were all around this. But anyway, it was always American. And then you have the World Food Program in Rome, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, you have all the sectors of life, of management, of economy, finance. You have it all. The monopoly to control the population is in the United Nations, and even more, because I heard, I had to look into what is going on with Ukraine. a peace negotiation in Switzerland
Yeah.
with Zelensky, who's not a president anymore.
Yeah. Something
when
actually
you-
that most people do not even know. I know if you ask people here in the United States, they have no idea actually that Zelensky's term is actually over. So we're giving all this money in the name of democracy to a country that actually has put the pause button on democracy itself.
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly. And without the country, the main country was
Yeah.
not invited, Russia.
Yeah.
And then they blame now that Russia doesn't want to join. It's great. It's really, and so why I'm saying that, because Switzerland is paying a lot of amount of money, but what's interesting is that the UN is meeting from 25th to 27th of June in Montreux in Switzerland, and it is the Interagency for Security Management Network of the United Nations, from the Department of General Assembly of Conference Management, bringing all the countries that want to come and discuss Ukraine and Russia and Palestine and Gaza. Nobody knows about that. And they meet twice a year. And in there, who are the main players? 32 agencies of the United Nations. Not all of them. And they call it UNSCEB. You can go and look at it. The United Nations System Chief Executive Board for Coordination of the United Nations. This is new. It pops out like this. And if you don't know that actually the UN is managed by all the players of the COVID crisis. It is WHO, it is the World Food Program, it is the IATA and ICAO, the aviation organizations, the transport, the maritime, etc., etc. And you go, why did they choose this? Why? And of course, the digital, international trade, telecommunication, etc. You can go and look at it. And they take care of occupational health, of community management, of interagency security management. So there is a core group there holding this coup d'etat, to my understanding. They are just playing behind the scene with decision making with a corporation that knows what they're doing. But they are definitely, like Shabnam said, it's like a cartel, because they have a logic of the business. They don't understand law, because they are illegal with their own charter of the United Nations, illegal with the WHO constitution. Even WHO is illegal with its own constitution, and it's the only constitution in the whole United Nations. That's why it's the entry door. But you see what I mean? They're not obeying to the UN charter that they have built. They only have a logic of business, with McKinsey doing the strategic operation. We know that for sure. I have numbers. I cannot pull them out now, but I can pull them out another time. Millions to McKinsey and Deloitte.
Yep. They definitely, that's always how it works. But two questions with all this. So when you look at the only way why they're empowered is because we, the people, have been sleeping. So clearly we have not stepped up the pressure, and because this is what gives the technocrats particularly a lever, so to speak, to threaten political leaders, because they can say, we can turn the public against you. I mean, this is really the major Damocles sword, right? If you do sanctions, they get a country can get economically hurt, people get hurt, they oust the political leader. I mean, that's the mechanism. But it only works because we, the people, buy into this thing, right? And the other question is, then, if we have political leaders, why aren't they stepping up and say no? Are we just having too weak leaders? Shabnam?
Well, I think it's a matter of the carrot or the stick. In many instances, it's the carrot of funding for various programs in your country, like the WHO in Africa funding for malaria or TB or HIV, etc., which is essentially money laundering, right? Because the pharmaceutical industry funds the salaries of the WHO, essentially, who then make policy recommendations in favor of those pharmaceutical industries, who then sell those products into our countries. Then a tiny part of that budget goes into supporting various so-called health programs in our countries, including unsafe, ineffective, and unnecessary vaccines. The other mechanism is, of course, the stick, right? The carrot or the stick is threats if you don't comply. Apart from sanctions and maligning your country and downgrading your country's economic status in the world and calling on you to repay your IMF and World Banks, they can also politically or physically assassinate your leaders, right? Or they can, they've got a whole host of threats that they can use. In fact, I would highly recommend reading the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman to know essentially that they have these hitmen around the world that sabotage countries' economies and put them in a position where they feel they have no choice but to comply with the dictates of the UN, the WHO, and of course the bigger powers behind them, whose faces we don't see, whose names we don't know. But ultimately we're dealing with corporate colonialism. If you look at, for example, the Pfizer contracts, and I've spoken about this one many times in the last couple of years, and it's so shocking to me that Pfizer tried to sign agreements with African and Latin American countries in which they wanted as security for their rubbish product a country's military bases, embassies, and reserve banks. So all they would need to do is collapse your country economically, collect on that debt, and if you can't pay it back, we'll just take your country's sovereign assets. And so the war is different now. Apart from dropping bombs and decimating people, in this instance, they don't need to drop a bomb to claim your country's sovereign assets and to own your country's right to self-determine. Now, our country's former health minister said he hadn't signed up to that agreement. But how do we know that? Many of these contracts are so redacted, and with non-disclosure agreements, we actually have no idea. Apparently, Latin America tried to resist, but do we really know? And so essentially what we have is corporate colonialism that's operating in different parts of our world. We have to recognize we have a common enemy. It is the 1% predator or parasite class versus the rest of us. And yes, we are constrained with leaders who are afraid or who are corrupt, and we've got to get rid of them. And we have to engender in our societies direct democracy, where we vote for who the president's going to be, who the ministers are going to be, what is the extent of their powers, how do we get rid of them? As long as we have representative democracy, which hasn't worked globally or historically, it's going to become very difficult to extricate ourselves from the matrix. But having said that, even people like Klaus Schwab are recognizing the massive resistance that has built around the world, especially over the last 4 years.
Yeah, I think they actually underestimated that. I do believe they underestimated that.
They did, but they recognize the enormous amount of power that we have, and we need to put that power into place in practical means. For example, using mechanisms like boycott, sanctions, and divestment to ensure that decisions that are made in our countries benefit us, and to ensure that we withdraw from this hydra of the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, and by extension, the smaller bodies like the WHO. I've drafted a bill called WHO withdrawal bill, which we do need to mobilize around in our country. We've just had elections here, but I would certainly encourage your viewers to make these subjects voting issues. Make sure political parties, if you believe in the political system as it stands, which I don't, that if you do not comply with the will of the people, we're simply not going to vote for you. We are more powerful than you. You can be replaced.
Yeah. You know, what we haven't talked about yet, and you mentioned actually two of those, are how does the World Bank and the IMF, for example, figure in? Because they are kind of the whip holders, so to speak, the executors, because they can rein in a country. It's a perfect means to make underdeveloped countries completely dependent on the money flow, and thus shackle them as debt slaves and really put them in the hand of this. Are they a direct part of this overall construct, Astrid?
Absolutely. Go ahead. Let's take turns.
Either one of you.
No, Astrid, let's take turns.
Well, yeah, I worked for the World Bank for a moment on ethics, and they had a circle of religious leaders to eradicate poverty. So I met with James Wolfenson at that time with religious leaders, because I thought that's great, morals in the World Bank, And he had tried to really, set the World Bank in an ethical framework. I could say today he died in 2019, but he was not taking care of health. So this is what I was surprised. I said, why are you not taking care of old people and health? So there is money flowing, but not always in the areas that are flowing today. But what happened when I saw what's going on with COVID, I found well, first of all, James Wolfson stepped down in 2005, and the Bush administration in 2006 put Wolfowitz at the head of the World Bank, who is a warmonger, and he was for the Iraq War, etc. So it changed completely the World Bank, and it was not coincidental, but it was definitely probably planned, that the World Bank made a contract with WHO and Gavi, Bill Gates in 2005-6 with Wolfowitz, and they built a bond system with the International Financing Facility for immunization, equal vaccination. And I found that paper. I talked about it on the grand jury of Reiner Filmisch, and I was so shocked. I thought, what's going on? Who knows? You see, it's not about only we the people. We are kept in ignorance of what's going on. And that was really a shock, that nobody is aware of what's going on behind the scene, playing with bonds on vaccines. And I learn now more and more. Moderna has flown up 75% in bonds since the beginning of the year, because they're making again a drumming on flus and stuff like that. But anyway, so World Bank, Gavi, and WHO made a commitment in 2006 to vaccinate everybody through CEPI, a coalition for epidemic and innovation. And this is what has been leading the global program of vaccine of Bill Gates in WHO since 2010 to 2020, and still today. And so this is just to show you one thing that nobody is aware of. And I question everybody, where does this money come from? Where is it going? Where are our taxes going? And we have no more hand on our life, because we pay tax and we don't know where the tax go.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. I can challenge anybody to give me the flow of money in the United Nations. It's not possible. So it's like Shannon say, it is the private sector has stepped in and is controlling the system by corruption, by forcing. And I think really, I think we will not be surprised to find that the United Nations is a corporation, and that our member states have signed as the government is actually a product of this corporation, and we are just the assets working for them. And this is under this you probably know about this, Nicolette, also. It's between Vatican, London, and Washington DC, the big agreement that has been done 200 years ago, and that we are out of now. But if people don't understand this, they don't understand what happened to us with COVID. This was a forcing abuse of all the natural human rights, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to natural law to our basic human rights, to all the rights written in the United Nations. So, I mean, you cannot deny that they have been breaching the law. They are criminals. And now the big question is, where is the police to arrest them? And
or how do we actually hold them accountable, and we the people step up and get rid of those criminals?
Yeah, the joke is that they have built a system that the casque bleu, the blue helmets, peace operation, are just puppets of the whole system, and they hold the International Criminal Court of Justice and Criminal Court and Court of Justice in their hands. You can just watch Rwanda. When Rwanda genocide happened, Romeo Dallaire, the general who was in place, called Kofi Annan, come and save Rwanda. There is something is going to happen. Nobody was sent from the United Nations Peace Corporation. So it's not working since a long time.
No.
But today we can see it and we can talk about it, and it's an incredible opportunity, and thank you for inviting us, because I'm very glad we can talk about this.
We have to talk about this, but you know what I'm wondering also? Do you think this is kind of like a machine that has taken on a life on its own, so to speak, or are there really some key puppeteers behind the whole scene. When you think about this whole thing has been going on, we're talking about a long lifespan. When you mentioned it started sort of going back to World War I, so that's over 100 years. So that means definitely not the person that's still alive at that point. So it's been kind of meddling going forward. I'm just wondering, when you look at machines, how they work sometimes, and particularly bureaucracies or any system really, once the machine gets rolling, it's very hard to break the mechanism of the machine, because at some point the machinery takes over whoever sort of starts running the machine. What do you think?
Well, that's where we are with artificial intelligence. If you're listening to experts that are not conflicted, they are warning us and telling us that artificial intelligence is an existential threat to humanity. When the machines believe they are more intelligent than us, and they can do a better job at making decisions than us, then all of the science fiction movies that we've watched, whether it's iRobot or Transformers or The Matrix and Mr. Smith, are going to be far more real and palpable than we could have ever imagined. Artificial intelligence is already being used in certain conflicts around the world, including in Palestine, technology called Lavender and GoDaddy, for example, that is decimating entire families. And what they do in some parts of our world, they will do to us. We can see now World War III expanding. I mean, it's been on low boil for a long time. We don't need a newspaper headline to tell us we're in World War III. We see it happening. It's expanding now from the Middle East into Europe between Russia and the NATO alliance, which of course has its roots in Nazi Germany, and people now being automatically conscripted in the army in the US, in the UK, etc. So they are building up. And Germany. So they are certainly building up to an amplified or a loud World War III. We have to be categorically anti-war, not just pro-peace, but anti-war. And we can actually connect the dots between COVID-19 and wars, because the main industries that benefit from wars include the banks that we talked about just now, insurance, weapons, construction, well-funded think tanks, corporate media, and captured political parties. The weapons industry made at least 5% more profit last year than the previous year. 5% is a lot. 5 of the top 6 global defense corporations, and this is an article that I wrote called Wage Peace for World Council for Health, are Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, now called RTX, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and General Dynamics. All of them sell weapons that fuel conflict and harm people. So they have an interest in unending conflict, and they took $196 billion in military-related revenue in 2022. So therefore, there's this revolving door between politicians and the weapons military-industrial complex in the US and other parts of the world. Now, the top shareholders in these 5 defense companies also came under spotlight during COVID-19. They're the same people. They largely consist of big asset managers or big banks with asset management wings, such as BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity Capital Group, Wellington, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Newport Trust Company, Longview Asset Management, Massachusetts Financial Services, Geode Capital, and the Bank of America. So it is essential that we do not invest in the very same corporations and banks and investment companies that are harming people anywhere around the world. They are the same people. We have a common enemy. I also want to just highlight, when we're talking now about the UN, they have the Summit of the Future coming up in September, where they plan to pass this Pact for the Future and encourage countries to go along with this emergency platform, essentially a one world government around those 10 areas we spoke about earlier, including pandemics, climate change, and war. So this is what the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said. How will this platform be funded, right? We always follow the money. Upon activation of an emergency platform, initial operating costs will be met from existing resources. Thereafter, United Nations entities and other relevant actors, Astrid, would be asked to provide support for the day-to-day running of the emergency platform, including through the secondment of technical experts. And we know they love the hundreds and thousands of consultants, right?
Expert nations, right?
Right. In addition, there would be a requirement to mobilize financial resources for specific response activities subject to relevant factors, including the type of shock, the appropriateness of existing sector-specific financing tools, and the scale of the crisis. All I'm hearing is money laundering and resource extraction. and saying to companies who cannot afford the kind of money they're looking at, well, if you can't afford the money, you could give us and the companies that back us rights and shares into your mineral resources. Africa and the Middle East, for example, would be prime targets for this. Or you could take another loan from the IMF and the World Bank, trapping you in debt slavery, where generations of your children would never be able to pay it back. We have to extricate ourselves from the system, and one of the most powerful ways to do that, stop investing in the institutions and the corporations that are violating our fundamental human rights.
Absolutely. I think this is really wonderful. At this place, I do want to play a video actually for our viewers to show you a little bit what's really at stake here and why you really need to get a little bit more involved into all these things, how they're interconnected and what's going on, because you are exactly involved as everyone else, whether you know it or not. By doing nothing, you're involved, and by looking away, you're involved, and by being silent, you're involved, and by speaking up, you at least can take a little bit more of an active role. So watch.
We have more power than you can dream of.
Truth is the foundation of all of our lives.
We cannot forget the angels, the deities, the spirit that connects us to the earth.
It's going to be a new world, definitely. It's becoming a new world already.
When it comes back to prophecies, you're born in this moment, you're born in this time for a reason.
We can change things. It's going to take people to collaborate and really want to celebrate and support one another instead of competing and tearing each other down.
All it takes really is a collective decision to change. I absolutely believe in a divine plan, and that never fails. It just may take some time.
There's no one person that is coming to save us. Our redemption will be in our collective action of coming together as one unified body of people.
We cannot do this separately and win this battle about evil. We have to do it together.
I am you, you are me. Everything that is happening is a reflection of what is happening inside of us.
Let's switch gear here for a moment.
Can I make a comment on this?
Please. Yeah.
Because the experience I have with the UN is that they love those summits. There was a Millennium Summit in 2000, which they used to create the MDG, the Millennium Development, the Millennium Goals.
Yep.
15 years of goals. And then 2015, the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals of the Agenda 2030. That it is very, we have to be very careful what's going on there, because this future summit, I was in an NGO I know all the heads of the NGO conference of NGOs of the UN, and so and they mentioned this future summit. And when you see the state of the NGO activities, it's very poor at the moment because of COVID. So that's the first red flag. The second is they have an intention to create a reaffirmation of Agenda 2030 with even a more forceful agenda. So we have to definitely move very quickly, like, you know, Shabnam, you're saying, and Nicolette, we have to say it's not the UN future, it is our future, we the people, because it has to be dismantled. I'm not just for exiting, I'm really for saying it is finished. It's over. The system has to be dismantled. It's not like this we want to function. It is beyond our reach. It has been a supra AI system and everything else. We don't know who is financing who, and we want to decide. It's very simple. And so we have to say no, really.
Exactly, and that brings me right to what I want to get into here, and that's the sustainability part of it, because that's the other red flag, because there's so much talk on their part about sustainability, but when you really look at what are the key principles of sustainability, it starts with self-regulation. Every living organism is a self-regulated, self-governed system. That's what it is. You have so the self-regulation for humans, particularly when you look at what differentiates a human being from all the other organisms that are out there, it is the free will that we've been given. We have been given the free will to make who we want to be, what we want to be, and determine our lives, how we want to live them going forward. So these are total principles that are completely neglected the whole time. So when we talk about self-governance, particularly self-regulation, it's a total opposite of what all these inflated, totally big fat belly organizations are doing. That should everyone give actually reason to think about, you know, what this is all going to be. So when we create something that's sustainable, shouldn't we have systems in place and modus operandi, and I don't even want to call it institutions because I think we can do without. But the thing is that really is aligned with the principles, the core principles of every living organism, because only then is it sustainable. That's why nature has been around for what, 4.5 billion years. Every other system is transient. They come and they go. So that but people always talk about sustainability, and I will ask my viewers too, because they know, I mean, you know, I'm outspoken about this, because we cannot talk about sustainability without understanding the laws of nature and the mechanisms of nature and the principles of nature, of living organisms. And that's completely opposite of those big constructs, that hierarchies, those spider webs of institutions that we have in place.
Absolutely. I mean, the World Council for Health, on whose steering committee I serve and who Astrid is a very dear friend too, operates firstly without any funding from the pharmaceutical industry or psychopathic billionaires. And it has a Better Way charter of 7 principles, which you can find on the website worldcouncilforhealth.org. 1, we act in honor and we do no harm. 2, we are free beings with free will. 3, we are part of nature. 4, spirituality is integral to our well-being. 5, we thrive together. 6, we value different perspectives. And 7, we use technology with discernment. Finally, last but not least, with courage, we do not tolerate 1, the violation of people's inalienable rights and freedoms, and 2, profit, power, and influence coming before the well-being of people and planet. So we already have organizations like the World Council for Health that represents the better way, an alternative to the parasite class. And I think it's important we spend half of our time resisting, but the other half of our time building the better way, building the kind of world that we as the 99% need, want, and deserve. And for me, what's on my mind every single day, increasingly so, is growing food. Growing food is a powerful act of resistance. Everyone needs to be doing it, and we can see what's happening with threats against farmers in different parts of our world, where they're being forced to introduce technologies, including GMO, that they don't want to, where they're being forced not to water their crops, And we are seeing uprisings in certain parts of the world. But once they introduce that food shortage, they're going to be able to force certain people to comply, which is why we have to go back to becoming radically healthy and growing food. That's going to be two things that I'm going to be talking about a lot in terms of what are the tangible actions we can take. Not only do we need to protect farmers, we need to become farmers.
So what would you, Astrid, what would you want, for example, people, in this case our viewers, to remember every time now when they hear the United Nations? What are some key mechanisms that you think they should keep in the back of their minds whenever they hear something about United Nations or the WHO or another pandemic?
Well, I would first have the reflex of saying, how can one world government, how can WHO or the United Nations standardize my life and the life of my country? So how come they are giving one word that there is one virus on one side of the earth, everybody is sick? That's what they did in COVID. So they have to understand that they have created a trigger mechanism of fear, and they want to make you fearful. So if you are afraid, think, no, why am I afraid of what? You know, and you start thinking backwards to say, where is the proof? Because what they're using as a proof is images, which is not a proof. They have the same algorithm of always lying, deception, and trying to make you fearful, so you run into their solution. And you have to look at the game from a distance and say, okay, now, they want to make you fearful for climate. So if there is a flood, you need to sell your land because they want to take it over, or you have to vaccinate all your crops, but no, your crops too, but your animals in your farm, because suddenly there's a bird flu in north of Africa, and then Europe and South Africa have to start vaccinating by preventive measures their animals in the farm. This is already happening, actually. And so you have to understand that what they want is life. They want to take away your life goods, your life, your living, your loving thing, nature, and try to make you put you in a poverty of mindset with images, etc. So just get back your sovereignty. Your sovereignty is the most important. You have the right to breathe, the right to stand up, the right to say no, the right to love your children and say that you don't want this bullshit of drag queens. I'm sorry with the language, but really it's horrible. They're trying to destroy families and children. Yeah. And this agenda is today very clear to the experts that we are, and we want to prevent that get together with your community. And like Shabnam said, take care of your land, of your food, of your animals, and all your family has to learn the new skills that they have taken away from the schools, is learn morals, ethics, but how to cook cheap. You don't need much. The earth is giving you for free your food. I mean, really, it's amazing the earth we have. Right. Because you have to know that what they're creating, WHO, is now a one food system. You see the One Health, one food system, one animal health, and they're doing collaborations and contracts with the animal health, with the World Food Program, and they want to take it all with the digital and never accept a digital, a digital identity that will take you into a cage. Think in advance what they want to do. That's the ticket to hell. That's what we want people to remember. It really is the ticket to hell. So if you want to know what it's like to be slaved again or enslaved again, then you go for the digital ID. All the rest of us is actually staying clear of that. I think that's a very, very good point. I want to add keep cash. Yeah, keep cash. I want to add one other thing, because when you actually look at the meaning and the word origin of dignity, it is self-determination. So there's all this talk about human dignity, and yet the one thing that really makes up dignity, meaning self-determination, is the one thing that's being chipped away off bit by bit if
We the people let them. So there's a big push. There is actually a lot more, even though you may not hear about this because mainstream media usually doesn't talk about these things, but trust me and believe me, you can do your own research. There are a lot of streams and movements where we find better ways of actually creating our lives going forward, not being shackled or sort of dependent on all these financial ties and institutional ties and system ties from systems that are actually doomed to fail to begin with. So on that note, thank you very much, ladies. Thanks so much for joining us. It was a great discussion. And for you at home, I hope you took something from that. It was a lot of things we covered, a lot of grounds we covered. For some, it may be something maybe they haven't heard. For others, it may be confirmation of what they already knew. And yet for others, it might give you reason to actually dive in a little deeper. In either case, I really invite you to do your own research and start your own self-thinking as always, because this is the way to go. We have to get independent from experts and external authorities and all these other people who tell you what to do. At the end of the day, only you know what's good for you and for your family, and then collectively for all of us. On that note, thank you very much for watching. We see you next week.